We've been talking about the life and times of Jesus, so I thought I'd go back over the Great Commission again. No, just kidding. Actually, I'm going to go the other end of the Bible. I'm going to take us all the way back into Exodus, and so we're going to go back, and it's about 1,200, 1,300 years ago, 300 years before the birth of Jesus. So we're going to take it back a bit, and we're going to talk about Moses and a small group that Moses had. But before we do that, I wonder if you've ever been in a situation where you could have taken advice, you could have sought someone's help, but you've chosen not to. You've decided to go on your own, so it's been a choice to go on your own, and it probably hasn't worked out as well as you'd hoped. I suspect that anyone over the age of about 2 has got a story along those lines. And for me, I was a young platoon commander. I was a lieutenant in Hong Kong. This is before it was handed back to the Chinese, when it was a British colony. And so we were over there working with the Gurkhas and with the British Royal Marines. And we were doing a bunch of activities with them. Smuggling at the time was a big problem in Hong Kong, between mainland China and Hong Kong. And so we were going to be doing this activity where we were going to go out on amphibious ships, and we were going to land on this island that was well known as a smuggling sort of area. And so I had the job of planning it. My platoon was coming in from the southern side. We were going to land and sort of sweep over this island. And so I had to plan it. And normally, the way the army works is I was a young platoon commander. I had about 30 guys. But I also had a platoon sergeant who was a very experienced soldier. He'd been in the army about 15 years. And so he was there to, I suppose, one, try and curb my natural energy and inclination to do really silly things. And so between the two of us, my energy and training and his experience generally will work out pretty well. But the problem was, in this particular case, is that he had dysentery, and he was very, very ill. And so I decided I'd do the planning for this one on my own because I didn't want to bother him. And he wasn't that well, and he actually said to me, "Do you want me to help?" And I said, "No, Stan, you're pretty sick. Why don't you just sort of sit this one out?" And because he had to still go with us on the next day, and so he had to do a bit of recovery. So anyway, I got the map out and I had a look. And if you know anything about topographic maps, essentially they have these things called contour lines, and they mark the heights. So essentially, you can see how high you are, and based on how many contour lines there are, you can see if it's a steep or if it's going downhill or how it's working. So every 5 metres is sort of marked on this map of elevation. So if they're marked over time, like if they're a long way apart, it's a gentle sort of run, right? Because there's a lot of gaps between the 5 metre increases. Of course, if they're close together, it's a steeper thing. Pretty basic map stuff. Well, I had a look at this island, and there was only one contour line running around this island, the edge of the island that we were going to be crossing. And I thought to myself, well, that'll be easy. It'll be nice and flat. So I told my guys in the orders, it's going to be flat. Flat as a tack, boys. And we're just going to get there. It's going to be nice and easy. Just take all your kit. It'll all be fine. And so we got on the next morning. We got on the landing barges, and we're heading off. It was those, pretty much, if you've seen Saving Private Ryan or a movie like that, they look just like that, with the ramp at the front. And in fact, with the they were run by the British, of course, because they're in Hong Kong at the time. So we trundled off. It was very thick fog. And as we came through the fog into the island, as we got to the island, the fog parted. There was a massive cliff. And the problem, of course, was that wasn't one contour line. That was about 5 contour lines so close together that looked like one contour line. And of course, you're thinking 5 metres, all within a very short period of time, equals cliff. Now, it's a pretty rookie mistake to make, because there are indicators on a map that'll tell you that sort of stuff. All you have to do is look around, you'll see it marked or whatever. And my platoon sergeant probably would have picked the error in a heartbeat. But of course, I didn't want to bother him at the time. I was doing it for all the right motivations, but I had the opportunity to seek his assistance, and I chose not to. It didn't work out too well for me. In fact, as we came along the thing, there were 30 faces that all turned and looked back at me. And we hadn't bought any climbing gear, we hadn't bought anything, so we had to free climb up this hill with all of our kit, and all the soldiers just thought I was the best officer ever, as you can imagine. So I think we all have a story. We all have a time when we could have taken the advice or assistance of other people, but we've chosen not to, and we've reaped the whirlwind as a result. Well, we're going to have a look at the Bible, in the Bible actually, of an instance where a couple of guys did take each other's assistance. And so we're going to be going to Exodus 17, and it's a story. I'll give you the background in a sec, but it starts off at Exodus 17, verse 8. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." So Joseph did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun, and Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. It's a great word, that overwhelmed. Actually, in the Hebrew, they use the term weakened. It's one of those euphemisms, isn't it? You know, it's sort of like Adam knew Eve and she conceived. I mean, that's a pretty good way of knowing someone, isn't it? But this is one of those euphemisms, right, where they say he weakened Amalek. Well, in fact, you know, they slaughtered them. That's essentially what it was. You might find even the King James Version loves to do euphemisms. I think it even says, it uses something along the lines of it discomforted them with the sword. That's what the thing. So, you know, I imagine discomforting someone with a sword. It would be fairly uncomfortable, wouldn't it, being whacked with a sword? But essentially overwhelmed. So they were destroyed. Well, not totally, but in this particular case, in this area, they were wiped out. But we're going to hear from the Amaleks. When you read through the Bible, you hear from the Amaleks all the time. And there's a reason for that, because they were one of Israel's most hated enemies. So let's have some of the background. Well, if you have a look on a map, you'll see up here that they've come out of Egypt, and where they are now is they're about halfway in their journey down to Mount Sinai. So they've left Egypt, they've escaped from Egypt, and they're heading down towards Mount Sinai. And so a couple of things have happened. It's been about 3 months since they've escaped out of Egypt. They've been given manna, so that's where God has actually given them the food that they need to exist on, both manna and quail. So they make bread out of the manna, and they've got meat. I mean, bread and meat sounds like the men's barbecue, doesn't it? So God, that's why, I mean, God's a God of men, isn't he? He gives them bread and meat. It's fantastic. There's no even mention of green stuff in there. Excellent. So, and so he's given them manna. On top of that, they've arrived at Rephidim, which they're not too sure where it is now, but they think it was a wadi, so they think it was like a creek that sometimes would run, sometimes wouldn't run. And when they've arrived at this sort of oasis place, there's no water there. And so God has delivered water for them through a rock. So they've had this miraculous gush of water that's come. So God's provided them with their food, God's provided them with their water, and now they're at Rephidim, which is where we find the story, and they have the fight with the Amalekites. And so if you have a look at Rephidim, this is where they think it is. You can see it's sort of a bit of an oasis thing. That's a more modern day, of course, shot of where they believe Rephidim is. And from here, after this story, the Israelites go off to Mount Sinai. And, of course, they receive the law from God in Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments, you know, Charlton Heston stepping off the mountain with the big stone tablets, all that sort of stuff. That's all coming up very next. So this is right between leaving Egypt and before they get the law at Mount Sinai. It's also the first time as a nation they actually go to war. So they're going to do lots and lots of it. But remember, they've been brick-making slaves in Egypt, so the chances are these guys have no idea what they're doing. There's a pretty good chance that they really don't know what they're doing. There probably wouldn't have been any with great experience in the Egyptian army, maybe some, but it would probably been unlikely. And so they're really learning it from the first-hand accounts. You know, they were going to get all of their experience on the battlefield, which I can tell you as an ex-soldier, you'd much rather learn from everyone else's mistakes than your own. And unfortunately, these guys, this is their first go. Now, who are the Amalekites? Well, the Amalekites are hated people for the Israelites, which is strange because they actually share the same ancestor, Abraham. The Amalekites are actually descendants from Esau. So if you remember the account of the Israelites, they came through Jacob, who of course was renamed Israel. But the Amalekites, they were descended out of Esau. And so they had a bit of a grudge against the Israelites, and probably a fairly reasonable as well. Because if you remember the story, Jacob had tricked Esau into getting the inheritance. And then he'd scampered and taken it. And so you can imagine over 500 years while they're in Egypt, this has been passed down from father to son, all about these scumbag Israelites who had stolen the rightful heritage of Esau. And as a result, there they are, living in the Sinai desert and in the southern part of Palestine, grubbing out a pretty miserable existence, while the Israelites, of course, have come out of Egypt loaded up with all sorts of stuff. They're groaning with riches as they bolt out of Egypt. So the Amalekites had a pretty good reason not to like the Israelites. And of course, the Israelites didn't like it either. In fact, this is very common in this part of the world. In Afghanistan, where they speak Pashtun, this Pashtun word in Afghanistan for enemy is the same one that they use for cousin. So it gives you an idea that actually this sort of warfare against your close kin is the sort of thing that was very common back in those days. And so these guys are related. They're the same racial stock, but actually they hate each other, probably more than they hate the other races. In fact, even today, if they have this festival in Israel, they have a number of festivals where they celebrate today the various times they've been delivered in their history. So they celebrate the Passover when they were delivered out of Egypt. And one of the festivals they do is called the Festival of Purim. And Purim, they celebrate the deliverance in the Persian times that we see accounted in the book of Esther. And so they celebrate the fact that Esther, through her faithfulness and some cunning in some ways, they overcame, guess who? Haman. Haman was a bad guy. Guess who Haman was? An Amalekite. Haman was, he was one of the hated enemies. And what they even do today is, when they're telling little, like during the Festival of Purim, they'll have like puppet shows and children's shows and stuff that'll tell the story of Esther. And when Haman's name is said, everyone will hiss and boo. And the reason for it is, as we see later on, well, you will see if you keep reading on, God says he's going to blot out the memory of the Amalekites. And so the way that the modern days Jews do that is by hissing and booing whenever his name is said, because that's blotting out the memory of him. So even today, that antipathy is passed on all the way today. Well, guess who they get to fight first up? It's the guys who are going to become one of their most hated enemies. So we have a look at this account. We know the background to it now. We know what's going on. And we have a look in detail at what's going on. And they're not very experienced, and so they're having a fight. And generally what would happen in those days when they would fight was it was spearmen. And so they would have long lines of spearmen, and they would essentially push against each other. And the whole idea was to break the line of the other army. If you could break the line and get amongst them, then you could get in behind them, and then the real massacre would begin at that point. And what would happen, of course, as soon as you broke the line, most of the time, most armies would then give up and they would flee. And so most of the killing was actually done in those days in the pursuit. So they would pursue after these things. They'd surround little pockets of them and they'd slaughter them. And you see this mentioned quite often in the army, where they chase after these the people that they think, and they slaughter them. It's a pretty brutal. So you can imagine in this particular case, it's talking about when Moses has got his hands up, the Amalekites are winning. The Israel's winning, and when he's got his hands down, the Amalekites are winning. So you can imagine this pushing going on. And so when Moses' hands are down, the Amalekites are starting to push through the lines of the Israelites, and when his hands are up, the Israelites are pushing through the lines of the Amalekites. And so, of course, what happens eventually, the Amalekite line breaks, and therefore Joshua overwhelms them. So he chases them down, and he puts them to the sword, as it says is the case in the account. So what's this putting his hands up? What's that got to do with it? Is that some sort of strange mystical thing, power that Moses had? We know he had the staff of Moses in his hand, and in some accounts, if you see pictures of this sort of drawn, sometimes you'll see him standing there with the staff up, and it's all about the staff. In fact, I think the New Living Translation actually talks about him holding the staff up. The actual account is more what I've driven out there, which is actually talking all about his hands. It isn't actually talking about the staff at all. We know he had the staff with him. This is the same staff that he tapped the rock with and made the water come out, and that he turned into a snake in front of Pharaoh, and they gobbled up all the other staves that had turned into snakes, etc. So it was a pretty good stick. There's no doubt about that. But the chances are, when it's talking about him holding up his hands, it's actually referring to prayer, because this is one of the euphemisms that they have. It's an idiom. We have lots of idioms. For instance, if I was to say to you now, I'd like everyone to bow their head and close their eyes, you'd instantly know that I'm talking about we're going to pray, wouldn't you? I haven't said the word prayer. I haven't said we're going to pray. All I have to do is say, for most people who grow up in a Christian community, I want you to bow your head and close your eyes. If I was to say that to someone who had absolutely no understanding of that, and I was to say I want you to bow your head and close your eyes, they think I was asking you to go to sleep, which for some of us they do anyway. But for most of us, we're going to pray. And so this is one of those idioms. You find this in the Psalms. It's mentioned many, many times in the Psalms, raising the hands in prayer. It's in Lamentations. It's in Nehemiah. It's even in 1 Timothy 2 verse 8, which talks about raising your hands in prayer. So when it's talking about his hands being raised, the chances are what they're talking about there is when Moses is praying, they're winning, and when he's not praying, they're not. And so he's got his hands up, he's praying, they're winning, his hands go down. And of course, he gets tired, which is understandable, especially if one of his hands had a stick in it. And because this is going on all day, and so he's getting tired, and so they find a rock for him to sit on, and then they hold his hands up for him, which is, obviously so that he can continue praying, and they're helping him to pray. So if we have a look at this little group that's there, we've found that they've had their food provided by God, they've had their water provided by God, and on top of all of that, now they're getting the battle handed to them by God, because there's nothing they're doing. They probably, to be honest, they're probably really crap at fighting right now. They haven't done it before. They probably don't know what they're really doing. They've probably seen a bit of it. Maybe they've got some Egyptians who have been able to show them a bit, but they're not very good, and so they're really relying upon the prayer of God to make it all work for them. So we've got this little small group running. You can see up there, you can see Moses and Aaron and Hur. They're up there. They're very white, aren't they? I don't think that probably would have been the case, but that's what you get in the 18th century when people are painting things of the Holy Land. So let's have a look at the three folk who are there. Firstly, you've got Moses, who's the leader of the small group. Okay, so Moses is up there. Everyone needs a leader. This is what the Bible says about how good Moses is. It's from Deuteronomy 34, and it says, "And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to his land. And for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of Israel." That's pretty good, isn't it? That's a pretty good rap. Now, that was just after he died, but that's a pretty good rap. That's what the Bible has to say in summary about Moses. I wouldn't mind that sort of thing being said in summary about me. Now, you've also got Aaron. Now, Aaron's the spiritual guy in the small group. You know, each small group has a leader, and it also always has the spiritual guy in the small group, doesn't it? When you've been in a small group, there's always the guy who's the spiritual bloke. Now, he's the brother of Moses. We know he's pretty good. He ends up being the first high priest. He's selected by God to be the first high priest. So we can assume that he's actually a pretty spiritually connected bloke. And this is what Exodus says about him. "Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses," and that was because Moses kept coming up with reasons why he couldn't go and see the Pharaoh, and God got a bit impatient. Not a good thing, I'm thinking, to do to the creator of the universe. "And he said, 'Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well.'" This is God talking. "Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him." So that's Aaron. I mean, even God says this guy can speak well. That's a pretty good rap, really. I'm thinking, sometimes you go to conferences and they'll have a good communicator, on the thing. This person is a gifted communicator. Well, God is writing Aaron's little biography here, and God is saying he can speak well. So I reckon if God's rating him, we can assume that this guy can speak well, and the fact that he was chosen as the high priest probably tells us he's a pretty spiritual guy. Let's have a look at Hur. We don't hear much about Hur. He's the faithful supporter in the small group. Every group has its faithful supporter, turn up all the time, do whatever's needed, brings the afternoon tea. The faithful supporter in the small group, this is Hur. So we don't get much on Hur, but we get a little bit. We know he was a key leader, and this is what it says in Exodus 24. It says, "So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God." This is when they were at Mount Sinai. So they've just arrived at Mount Sinai a bit later on. "And he said," this is Moses, "said to the elders, 'Wait here for us until we return to you, and behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute, let him go to them.'" Well, that's pretty good. He's been rated up there. He's like number 3, isn't he? He's the supporter. But we don't actually hear about Hur again after that. Hur sort of disappears off the biblical account. There are some other accounts. Josephus, who's a Jewish historian, he refers to Hur, and he tells us a little bit more. He tells us that he was Miriam's brother. So he was the brother-in-law of Moses. He was Miriam, Moses' brother's. Moses' sister is Miriam, and Hur was Miriam's husband. So we hear a little bit more. And then according to the Jewish tradition, so this is not the Bible, but it's a Jewish tradition, Hur actually came back at the end of the golden calf thing. What happens is the Israelites eventually get a bit tired of waiting for God, and so they build their own god out of gold, and they make a golden calf and they worship it. And according to the Jewish tradition, Hur comes back at the end of that, he walks in, he finds them all worshipping the calf, he tries to stop them, and they rip him to shreds, and they kill him. because he tries to stop them from worshipping the golden calf. That's in the Jewish tradition. It's certainly not biblical. I want to make that point. But it's, it's as good as any other history, isn't it? I mean, we believe Julius Caesar walked the planet because of history. He doesn't get mentioned in the Bible, but the historians mention him, so we're happy with that. So I think it's probably a reasonable account. So clearly he was a trusted man. In fact, his grandson builds the tabernacle. So his grandson's a tradie, and he's the one that actually is brought in as the head overseer on the tabernacle build when they finally do that. So clearly, that the family was well thought of. Her family was well thought of. Okay, so they're the three guys in this small group. They look pretty good. They're doing pretty good work. They managed to save Israel from the Amalekites, all looking pretty good. As a team, they work well. The problem with teams, though, is when you hear the term united we stand, there's a second part of that, and it's divided we fall. And that's the second part, unfortunately, of that very useful statement. So let's have a look at these three guys when they weren't with the small group. Well, Moses, he's the leader, right? He's the God-appointed leader. He's apparently full of leadership skills and leadership ability. Well, he's, as we know, very much the flawed hero. On the way to Egypt, God almost gets so frustrated with him, he's going to kill him, and his wife saves him because she steps in and circumcises their son, and as a result, God decides not to kill Moses. So it almost all ends at about Exodus 2, and it all sort of stops there. I suspect God had other plans that would have carried on quite well, and probably Exodus 4 would have looked exactly the same, but with another name. However, in this particular case, he gets saved. So he's supposedly the great leader, and his wife steps in and saves him. Just goes to prove the statement that behind every successful man, there's an incredulous woman. And so we see in this particular case, Moses is saved. Now, we know he can't speak. He either had a speech impediment or was so nervous in public that he couldn't speak. But he couldn't speak, so his brother Aaron had to do the speaking for him. That's got to be a hard thing for a leader, where you don't actually do the speaking. That's hard. He's got anger issues. There's a whole bunch of times where he gets angry at the Israelites, with God. I mean, he breaks the tablets when he gets them out of anger. He's got leadership issues. And the guy was hardly worshipped by his own people. After all, they continually kept rebelling against him. All the way through, the people keep rebelling against him. So this is supposedly the great leader. But let's have a look at when he's not with his small group, things don't seem to go as well, do they? Things don't seem to go quite as well for this guy. Now let's have a look at Aaron. He's the big spiritual one in the group, isn't he? Well, Aaron's the one that actually comes up with the plan to build the golden calf. That's Aaron's plan. He tries to get out of it later with Moses and says, it wasn't my fault. We just threw all this gold into the fire and out walked this calf. That's literally his excuse. He tries that on. Like, yeah, you expect that from your teenagers, right? But it's not going to run from the high priest, is it? I mean, if that's coming out of the high priest, that the board really needs to have a good hard look at that call, don't they? If that's his answer. But he's the spiritual one. He lies about it. He leads him into idolatry and then tries to get out of it by lying about what happened. Like, that's not too good. And what was happening around Aaron at the time? Where was Moses? Wasn't there. Where was Hur? Wasn't there. Aaron's on his own. Doesn't have his small group. Not looking too good as the spiritual one now, is he? And let's have a look at Hur. Well, he's the faithful supporter. Of course, he doesn't get a mention in the Bible. But if we take some of the history as reasonable to think about, then he was actually not there when Aaron's in this whole issue about the calf. The whole golden calf thing's going off. Hur's meant to be there. He's been appointed by Moses to settle disputes. We saw that. Moses appoints him to settle disputes. Where's he? Doesn't even get a mention. So even if that story that the Jewish tradition isn't true, it doesn't matter. Either way, he's not there. He's totally absent. So he's supposedly the faithful supporter. And of course, if we do believe the Jewish history, he doesn't have his small group, and what happens when he comes back? Well, a faithful supporter can't exert any influence because he doesn't have his small group to do that for him. And as a result, they kill him. So as a small group together, they're really strong, aren't they? They're doing this, it's because of their prayer, because of their actions, that they beat the Amalekites. It's because of the fact that they're praying to God that they beat the Amalekites. Now, it wasn't, of course, the strength of their arms or even the prayers. It was the answer to prayer that brings them to deliverance. But the bottom line is that they still had the job to play, didn't they? They had a role to play. And interesting enough, in this small group, the job wasn't just to support each other. There was something more to it. It just didn't say that they went away and had a prayer meeting while the Israelites had a fight, and then after the Israelites won, they came back and Moses and Aaron and Hur went, oh yeah, we were praying for that. I'm glad it worked out. No. These guys were on the hill being the decisive factor in this fight. So the job of their small group wasn't just to support each other. We know they did that. We know that they were much more effective when they were together. But the job of the small group was actually much larger than those three. The job of the small group was actually the good of the Israelite community. That's what they did. That was their focus of their particular small group. Now, that united we stand, divided we fall is hardly an isolated example in the Bible. If we have a look through the Bible, we'll see this constantly, both in the Old and the New Testament. You think about the King David. So David he has what they call the mighty men in the Bible. So he's this group of guys that hang around with him, and they go and fight with him wherever he goes. Well, there's the one time he decides not to hang out with the mighty men, and he lets the army go to war, and he stays back in the city, and he ends up getting in an adulterous relationship with one of his own soldiers' wives. Now, where was his small group? Well, they were actually doing what he should have been doing, which was off fighting. That's what he should have been doing. He was the king. He should have been leading them, but he wasn't. When he was with them, he was great. When his small group wasn't around him, what happened? He falls. He divided, he fell. Have a look at Elijah. Elijah gets to the point in his experience where he's so down that he asks God, he says to God, you might as well just kill me now. He's up on a mountain, he's had enough. He says, I might as well just die. And God actually gives him a bit of a rocket and says, get back up and get into it. And so when he goes down the hill, of course, he runs into a guy named Elisha. And of course, Elijah's ministry just fires off. He's now got someone he can mentor. He's got someone he can pass his ministry on to. He's got someone he can be accountable to. Bang, he's got himself a small group. And he's a lot more effective when Elisha comes on the scene. Have a look at Peter, the Apostle Peter. When the Apostle Peter's with his small group and they try and arrest Jesus, he pulls out a sword and whacks off someone's ear. Now, we're talking a group that are vastly outnumbered by armed men. And Peter's got enough courage to try and chop someone's ear off with a sword. Now, I don't imagine he aimed at his ear, just quietly. He probably wasn't very good with it. He was a fisherman. And so he's probably gone for sort of centre of the head. And he's sort of gone down the left-hand side or something like that. You know, he's probably not that good with the sword, but at least he's had a crack. He's had a bit of a go. Of course, that's Peter. But then we have a look just that same night. That happens. A bit later in the night, he's on his own. He's in a courtyard. And he's being asked whether or not he knows Jesus, and he denies him straight up. He curses it when he's doing it. He makes an oath that he doesn't know Jesus. This is how much his courage has run out when he's no longer with his small group. He's on his own. When he's with them, he's strong. When he's not with them, he's weak. We have a look at the Apostle Thomas. When Jesus first comes back and sees after he's been resurrected and he visits the apostles, Thomas isn't there. It doesn't say what Thomas is doing. I'm thinking Thomas surely should have been there. Would have been handy. Seeing the resurrected Messiah would be a pretty handy thing. But not Thomas. He's somewhere else. I don't know what he's doing. He's gone somewhere. And when he comes back, of course, he doesn't believe him. I'm not going to believe you. I'm not going to believe you, he says, until I, for myself, put my hands in the wounds. That's what he says. And, of course, he later does that. And then, of course, he's rebuked, isn't he, by Jesus? He says, blessed are those who have faith without getting the evidence. Those who have seen, who have the faith even without having seen. Seeing and sticking his hands, that's a gimme. What actually would have been greater was if he just believed it on faith. After all he'd been taught for 3 years, you would have thought he would have got the resurrection message at some stage. But, I mean, we're all like that, so I suppose we can't necessarily be too negative towards someone like Thomas. So when he's without his small group, hopeless. When he's with his small group, things are going well, then obviously things are going a lot better. We see this with Paul continually. When he's with people, at the time when you read his letters, the time when he's most down and he's asking for supporters, when he doesn't have any. The time when he's most on fire in his ministry and he's doing all this crazy stuff, he's got all the people around him. Things are going well. The only person that you'd have to argue operated the best without a small group was probably Jesus. And that reason was he didn't have all these deadbeats hanging around with him. You know, I mean, that's unfortunately the reality. I mean, the great message of the apostles is that they're just as bad as us. And so these aren't superheroes. These are guys just like us. And so Jesus used to go off all the time. I suspect part of it was he just wanted to go and talk to someone sane. when he went off to pray for hours and hours on end. But he was the only one. Now, unless you're going to rate yourself with Jesus, I suspect that all of us here are all in the circumstance where when we're surrounded by good Christian brothers and sisters who are providing us with support and encouragement, then our Christian lives will go well. And when we're not surrounded by that, then our Christian lives won't go so well. If you think you are if you think that you're the exception to the rule, that's okay. Then go and read the parts in Leviticus about emission of bodily fluids and about mould and that sort of stuff, because that's going to be much better. Don't read anything about humans, because if you do, it's going to tell you that we are a failed people and that we need other people around us to provide support. So stick to those things, or go into Numbers where they just list the tribes. That'll be pretty unthreatening to you as well. Go into there, just chapters and chapters. And I should preach on them one day, shouldn't I? That'd be fun. So where am I going with this? Well, you probably realise that we've been talking a lot about small groups coming up. There's been that ad going. We've been saying that small groups are coming. And today is the first day where we're actually going to be getting people to sign up for these groups. And so when Lex asked me to preach this, she asked me to preach quite a while ago, and I actually had a message prepared on blessings, because I think I'd promised I was going to preach on blessings. I think last time I preached, I said I'd preach on it. And until on Monday, the Holy Spirit said to me, "No, you've got to talk about small groups. That's what you're doing on Sunday. This is the next phase for the church." And so I had to sit down and I had to say to the Holy Spirit, "Man, you should see the blessings thing I've got. It's great. I've spent months on it. Are you kidding me?" And he said, I'm not interested. And you've got to preach on small groups. And so essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking, you have opportunities to sign up for small groups. And this is how it's going to work. The sign-up's going to go for the next 4 weeks. All the groups are listed. There's 15 of them, and they're listed outside on a board out near the coffee. We've put them close to the coffee because we know that's where most people are going to want to head. So you can go and have a look. There's 15 groups listed there. Next to that is a table, which will be manned by Janet and I. Probably more Janet than I. And then it won't be manned, will it, in that case? It'll be womaned by Janet. And so she's going to be there, and she's going to have the sign-up stuff. And all you have to do is sign up to is pick the number of your group. They're all numbered, and you then put your name down and you sign up for it. Now, you've got the next 4 weeks to sign up, and then they're going to commence. And they're going to go for up to 15 weeks. They're all a bit different. Some of them go for less than that. Some of them go 15 weeks. Excuse me. There's a huge variety. There's women's, there's men's, there's young adults, there's prayer groups, there's Bible study groups, there's parenting groups. There's a whole bunch of different things there, so you can go and find one that suits for your particular place and your particular path at the moment. All doing different sort of things, meeting at different times. Some of them are during the day, some of them are after hours, however you want to do it in different places around this local area. So the whole idea is you find one, you put your name down on the sheet, and then, of course, the leader gets in contact with you, and off you go. If you need more information, then you can speak to Janet. Unfortunately, Kate couldn't be here today, who's been coordinating the small groups, and so she's deputised Janet. And so Janet will be able to answer every question you have, absolutely every single question. She's going to be able to answer. You want to know how many pages are in the book that they're using? Janet can tell you. She can tell you it all. And just in case there happens to be one or two questions she doesn't know, then you can go and speak to the small group leader, because they're listed there, and they've even got a photo if you don't know who that person is, we'll be able to find out the information for you. So there's an opportunity starting this week for everyone to get involved and sign it up. Because the bottom line comes down to this, I suppose. We could have easily been monks. You can be saved without having another Christian person anywhere around you. And this is what the monks tried to do. This was the whole monastic movement in the 4th and 5th centuries. They thought it would be a lot easier if they just hadn't have to deal with anyone else. So it's just them and God. So they'd go and ferret themselves away in some cave, or they'd put themselves on a pole somewhere. And apparently that was working for them, so much so that you can't see any anymore. Righto? People don't monk anymore. Just doesn't happen. Even monks hang out with other monks now. Righto? This is the way it works. People have realised that the Christian life doesn't work on its own. It's not just meant to be done us as individuals. Otherwise, there'd be a lot less temptation if God had just created us all and kept us in our own box. Right? If he'd just done that, we could have had a relationship with him, 6 billion people in boxes having relationships with God, not having to worry about murdering anybody or falling into temptation or anything like that. That's not what God did. God's put us together because He knows that we are strong, and we are much more likely to be more effective at worshipping Him and doing the mission that He's put us to than when we're together. And small groups is one of those ways that we can do it. I know I've heard some great preaching, but I've got to tell you, I can tell you a lot more about the small groups that I've attended and the effect that they've had on my Christian life than I can on any particular preaching that I've had. I mean, sure, there's a cumulative effect in that, but you're going to forget what I've said in a week. You won't forget what study you're doing in your small group. You're not going to forget that in a week. That's something that you're going to take. When you do that together and you're spending a couple of hours a week, those relationships are going to last. And so I'd really encourage you, if you're not in a small group, then please get involved. If you are in a small group, you still have to sign up for that same small group. I know that sounds dumb, but we need you to, just so we know that you're signing up for that one and not one of the others, so we know. Especially since some of them are pretty short on numbers. There's only so many they can take because of someone's lounge room, I suppose, or something like that. And so, it really is, it's a bit of first come, first served in this particular case. So I really would encourage you to get involved in small groups if you can. I've heard lots of people say, small groups have those really annoying. Always get an annoying person in a small group. If you've been around a small groups, you're right. There's always someone who needs a bit of extra grace, isn't there, in your small group? In fact, Rick Warren talks about these people. He says he calls them the extra grace required folk. And he says that in most groups, there's someone who needs a little bit of extra grace, a little bit of extra care in every group. And if you're in a group that you can't see anyone, then it's you. So what I'd do is I'd encourage you, I'd really encourage you to get into the group. Don't let something like that just put you off, because that's not the case. You're going to make great friends, and you're going to have a great experience. All right, well, I might pray and then we'll be concluding. So don't forget the sign up. Don't forget the men's sign up. And I wish you all the best this week. Lord, we thank you that you have created us in a community. Lord, we know that that is your plan. Lord, we thank you for the lessons that the Bible gives us about how effective we are when we're in communities and how ineffective we become when we aren't. And so, Lord, I just pray that for each and every one of us here today, Lord, that you'll give us a clear message about how you wish us to respond to this church initiative with the small groups. Lord, I pray that for all of us that we'll be able to find a place that's going to suit our needs and to be able to build us into someone who you wish doing the mission that you want, Lord, for your glory. And we pray all these things in Jesus, your Son's special name. Amen.